Hello and welcome to the India Story. I'm Vikram Chandra and this is a really big moment for the India Story. Because for the next 24 hours, 48 hours and maybe after that, the attention of the world is firmly going to be fixed on India. Some of the biggest global leaders have already arrived here. Joe Biden arrived in India a short while back. Rishi Sunak was already in India. Other global leaders are going to be here as well. There are bilateral meetings taking place this evening between Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden. In fact, that bilateral meeting is supposed to start, well, about 4 or 5 minutes from now, we are told, is when that particular meeting is going to start between Joe Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But there will be other bilateral meetings today and tomorrow, and then, of course, the G20 summit. Over the course of the next 1 hour, we are going to be analyzing and trying to understand some of the really big questions around the G20 summit, the big themes that we really should look at if we want to understand it. And over the course of the next 1 hour, I'm going to have some of the top foreign policy thinkers in India and abroad joining us to help us analyze and understand some of these themes. So what are the themes? Number one, what is the big picture at the G20? What does it mean for India? What does it mean for the India story? What does it mean for the world? Question number two, is there actually going to be a consensus on a communique? So far, the Sherpas have been struggling. They've been struggling to try and reach some sort of a common voice which everyone can agree on. Is there going to be a communique? Will it be a German sense of what people are saying? We'll have to wait and find out. Question number three, or theme number three, are tensions between the West and then Russia, China, the big hurdle at this particular G20. We already know that Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping are not coming. Two notable absences. Everyone else is going to be here, but those two. So that's something which we have to really think about. And then, of course, perhaps the most important question of them all. Will India be able to get its developmental agenda through at the G20 summit? We've repeatedly heard it, including from the G20 chairman. Right on this program last week, Amitabh Kant told us what really matters to us is not the geopolitics. What matters to us is the developmental agenda and to see if we can get that through. So will it be successful? And of course, one final question which we should turn our attention to. Will New Delhi G20 be remembered? Because this is the particular time when the African Union actually became a member, got a seat on the high table. May happen over the next couple of days, so we're going to be discussing that. And as I said, a number of guests are going to be joining us over the course of the next 1 hour, but I'm going to start with one of the top foreign policy analysts I know of, Dhruva Jaishankar. It's great to have you joining us to help analyze what's going to be happening. Andrew Whitehead is joining us, historian, former editor of the BBC, joining us from London. Ashok Kantha with us as well. He's been ambassador to China and therefore would help us perhaps understand some of the implications around the China question in particular and the broader themes. But let me just start with what I began by saying, the big picture. Dhruva Jaishankar, what do you think is the big picture that we need to keep in mind when it comes to the G20 summit here in Delhi? Obviously, there's going to be all the dramatics. It's great to see Delhi decked up in the manner it is. A grand show is being put forward. That Mandapam is looking absolutely beautiful. I'm sure people are going to be, it's really a way of demonstrating the power and the rise of India. But other than, is that going to be the big picture, or is there going to be other stuff as well?
Well, I think it just, the G20 happens to be taking place, the G20 summit in Delhi happens to be taking place at a very important time, a very important juncture in international politics. And I think for a lot of the reasons that you and your viewers know, we're still recovering from a pandemic. There are major technological changes underway that are having an impact on national security and international competition. The trading order is getting more competitive. Geopolitical rivalries are becoming more center stage. War in Ukraine, and so this summit, which brings together the world's leading economies, is coming at this particular juncture. And the agenda then flows from that. How does one try to foster a sense of cooperation, at least on some issues, amidst this global churn and global turmoil? And that is in some ways what, if you had to summarize, what is this G20 about? What makes it so significant, apart from what the significance for India? I would say that would be it.
Okay, I'm going to come to the significance to India back to you in just a couple of minutes. But Andrew Whitehead, when the UK or the US or the West or Europe are looking at this G20, what are the expectations? What are they hoping to see achieved? I mean, India has already said that we would like the focus to be on the developmental agenda. We heard that from Amitabh Kant right on this program last week, very clearly laid out. But what is it that you think the countries of the West are expecting from this G20 summit?
Well, I think that they're hoping that there'll be a little bit of movement from India on Ukraine. After all, we're now in a situation where a major G20 nation is at war, and the war in Ukraine is arguably the greatest global peril to continued economic growth. So this is not a small issue. And of course, the G20 is very sharply divided over attitudes to Ukraine. And I think it will be a real test of India's diplomatic might and also of its diplomatic flexibility and finesse if it can find a way of putting together a meaningful communique which at least has something to say about the war, which probably won't be all that much discussed in the open, in the G20 formal discussions, but will certainly feature very prominently when Joe Biden meets Narendra Modi and then when Rishi Sunak meets Narendra Modi. And I think climate change is another issue in which there is a certain hope that India might show a little bit more flexibility. There's been some disappointment that India and China weren't more willing to come to the table at various international environmental discussions. But I think it's also, from India's point of view, this is a moment where India can stake its claim to be the really effective leader of the global south. And if it succeeds, and it looks like it will, in making the African Union a formal partner in G20, that will be quite a feather in India's cap.
All right, so I'm getting a sort of a big picture, and then we'll dive into some of those in greater details. Ambassador Kanta, China's Xi Jinping has decided not to come. And a lot of people are scratching their head as to why he would do it. Is it a snub to India? It doesn't want this to be a grand success for India? Or is it just he thinks this is going to end up being a slugfest between Russia, China, and the West, and he didn't want to be part of that? Or something else completely?
Vikram, it's very difficult for us to be sure what are the reasons behind Xi Jinping deciding not to come to G20 summit in New Delhi. As you know, he has attended all previous G20 summits in person or virtually since 2013. So this is a departure from past practice. Number of reasons are being given, including health, problems in Chinese economy, floods in China, domestic politics. But I believe more than the domestic factors, it's China's current predicament, both in its relations with India, as also the level of discomfort it's facing in G20 as a setting, problems in its engagement with the USA. That explains his absence. As you know, he had traveled to Johannesburg for BRICS summit. After BRICS summit, there have been further negative developments in India-China relations, including very different contradictory narratives coming out to countries on what happened in Johannesburg when Prime Minister Modi met with President Xi Jinping, controversy on China's so-called standard map. So there is definitely a kind of signaling to India.
All right,
but also I think,
You're saying something, Ambassador Kanta?
I'm saying that it's not just India, but it's also signaling to other member countries of G20, particularly Western countries, and lack of comfort with G20 as a platform compared to much higher level of comfort with...
Yeah, but obviously China prefers formats. China prefers formats which it can try and boss around, right? Where it can be the big kid on the block, where it can try and push people around. That's what China always prefers, and therefore I'm not surprised that they would therefore prefer SCO or other such forums rather than G20. But let me just come to the immediate issue. We've just seen these images, which we'll play for you again. Joe Biden arriving in India. Let's not forget, as we speak, there's that really important bilateral meeting taking place between him and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And obviously they have a lot to talk about, not just G20, building on whatever the success of that state visit in Washington is, talking about China perhaps, talking perhaps about whether any room forward can be made on the subjects of Russia and Ukraine. What do you think they're going to be talking about in that room right now?
Well, based on the pre-briefings that U.S. officials did before President Biden set off, it was the bilateral will really be focused on primarily on the bilateral agenda, obviously, and there's a lot to take away from Prime Minister Modi's state visit to the U.S. earlier this year. Some of the issues on the table are deeper defense cooperation, some trade issues, ironing out some trade issues, technological cooperation, and so forth. So I think that will be at least the focus of the bilateral meeting, I would imagine, based on what U.S. officials have said on background. But I think going into tomorrow, I think that President Biden himself has been quite supportive of India's G20 presidency, has seen this as an opportunity to push cooperation with India, including on matters where there's sort of a sharing, a mutual concern and a mutual objective, particularly in engagement with the global South. So that, I think, will feature on President Biden's agenda over the course of the next 2 days.
Right. So, Andrew, coming back to what you said, many in the West are going to be looking for and hoping for. Look, let's face it. When it comes to the communique, when it tries to come to consensus, I mean, there's only X amount that India or anybody else can do. It can't force Russia and China to put their names on resolution that they don't want to. Amitabh Kant did tell us that we're pushing, we are trying very hard. The Russians have accepted to some language around paragraph 3. It'll have to be see what can actually be done on that. And maybe a consensus will have to be found, and that's just the way it is. When it comes to the question of climate change, it's very possible that Prime Minister Modi could be doing a little bit of the tough talking and saying, look, the West to some extent has to step up. It's not as if India, or for that matter China, are not doing their bit to try and move to a more renewable future, even though they don't have historical responsibility. So in those bilateral meetings, is that where Prime Minister Modi could be doing a little bit of the talking too and saying, guys, you've got to try and help us get to a consensus out here?
Well, Vikram, I'm sure Narendra Modi will be saying that, and I think many people in the West will have some sympathy for that argument. It's certainly true that it's the Western nations which have historically have caused the bulk of the emissions of greenhouse gases which are causing climate change. I think the difficulty is that the optics are that India and China are not fully putting their weight to into the global efforts to achieve an early achievement of net zero. So I think that's unavoidable. And I think there will be a lot of pressure for India to modify its stand in this regard. And I think, you're right when you're talking about Ukraine and communiques. It's always a matter of finding a form of words which actually glosses over really quite sharp differences. But on climate change, I think there is a case that we all share an interest in actually getting on top of gas emissions, carbon emissions, and achieving net zero. But it's whether India will use a form of words which gives the impression that it's part of that joint effort, not standing aloof from it.
All right, Andrew, I know you have to leave us now. Thanks a lot for that. I think that subject of climate change and other issues, whatever emerges in that, requires a deeper discussion. I'm going to get you back on that as we go forward. Jaishankar, before we move to the question of specifically of Ukraine and Russia and what could happen around that, do you think language on climate change could be found? Because essentially India is going to probably certainly be saying, look, we have done X amount. So has China, so have many countries in the developed world. It's not that, India is, for example, ahead of most of the other countries when it comes to what it's actually delivering. The question of climate finance, though, is it going to be possible and assistance and development to other countries which are trying to make a change? Do you think it'll be possible to get language that will satisfy everyone?
So I actually would have to disagree with the assessment of my co-panelists there on where various countries stand when it comes to climate change. And I think, Vikram, as you mentioned, I think India has been taking its commitments made in Paris quite seriously. In fact, is doing, by most independent indications, is performing closer to its commitments than most other countries. Actually, in fact, the UK is another country that is doing rather well in that respect, but most Western countries are in fact not. If you look at the investment in renewables, India is actually taking, has the fifth largest installed capacity in solar. It's, in terms of new installations, it's third after China and the US. And if you look in terms of steps that India is making towards climate financing, it's actually quite progressive in many ways. Yeah. So I think there's a very archaic notion that just because India and China oppose certain commitments with regards to the phase out of coal at the Glasgow meeting of the COP, that just because of that India has a very backward, is not making sufficient commitments. Right. And I think the record actually points quite otherwise. The fact is, I think it's not just about words at the G20 summit. I think the real test is whether there can be actual deliverables when it comes to reforming multilateral institutions, including institutions such as the World Bank, to actually channel some of the financing, despite major commitments, they have not actually been delivered upon by the West, to helping countries in the developing world largely, who are both going to be the victims of climate change, who are going to suffer the most from it, and who have the greatest development needs, to actually go through with a development agenda that can meet climate objectives at the same time. And again, despite a lot of talk, that finance has not been forthcoming. So I think the real test will be whether India can use this presidency to channel some of the reform of multilateral institutions, get certain financing commitments, and not just leave it here at this, but actually follow up with this at the COP summit. Loss and damage, by the way, is another thing that has been resisted by the West. Follow up at the COP summit, it'll be part of the Troika at future G20 summits that will be chaired by Brazil and South Africa. That will be the real test.
All right, and Andreas Umland now joining us, analyst, Stockholm Center for East European Studies, joining us from Kiev, Ukraine. I want to turn my attention to Ukraine and Russia, because I'm sure that's going to be a large focus. But before I do that, if I could just, Ambassador Kantkar, get your sense on the sort of cleavages or the divides that we might find, which we've been noticing at the Sherpa meeting and which we might be noticing tomorrow. Look, there are certain issues on which there's the West and most other countries, in a sense, are perhaps looking at Russia and saying that, would you agree to a certain amount of language? That happens in some areas. When it comes to areas like climate change, we're just discussing, sometimes becomes the South versus the North. How is this dynamic actually playing itself out? Is it a very clear divide in most care areas, or is it sort of fluid in some sense, that you agree with these countries on X matters but don't agree on Y matters?
Well, there's no clear divide as such. There is East-West polarization, especially between China and the US-led West. There is also North-South divide, no doubt about it. But on different issues, coalitions are building. For instance, you refer to climate change. I'll entirely endorse what Dhruv said. Actually, India has done very well in terms of implementation of its NDCs, nationally determined commitments, whereas Western countries have not been able to come up with their commitments on climate finance. But there are other issues like Ukraine conflict, where we would have liked to go along with the Bali template, which was a compromise, which India also helped in drafting. Unfortunately, China and Russia has walked back from that compromise. So that has become a stumbling point now. Let's see how it's resolved. But the whole lot of other issues where we have, going by media reports, continuing our differences, including some of the issues where China has been far from cooperative. For instance, in question of debt distress of developing countries, or millet initiative of Prime Minister, or Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, or lifestyle for environment. A whole lot of those issues are there. I don't know what's the present state of play. G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant mentioned that there is, the leaders' declaration is almost ready. I'm sure we'll have a substantive outcome document emerging out of this G20 summit.
What exactly is there in the outcome document, obviously, is something that we're going to take a look at. Andreas, if I can just...
Major outcome will be AU joining as permanent member. That itself will be something, as a major deliverable of the New Delhi summit.
All right. Ambassador Kanta, I know you have to leave us now. Thank you so much for having been with us. And Sumlan, let me just welcome you, to this program. Looking at it from the point of view of, you're there in Ukraine right now. What practically do you think can be done at G20 to address the question of the war in Ukraine, to try and see language that could perhaps make everybody happy? Or is that something which is looking more or less impossible right now? Because China and Russia have backtracked from the position they took at Bali. That sort of language is not going to be acceptable anymore. So either you have a communique that is really wishy-washy on the question of Ukraine and the war there, or you will not have a communique at all. At least that's what many of the analysts seem to be telling us.
I think one would simply need to come back to the basic principles of the United Nations, of the international order, not of the international liberal order, but of international order in general, that borders are inviolable, that states have territorial integrity and political sovereignty. One does not even have to mention Ukraine if one puts that in there and then says that it also relates to, among other countries, Ukraine. That would be already sufficient. It would be, of course, against the interests of Russia, that does not recognize the borders and territorial integrity and political sovereignty of Ukraine. But maybe one can find a formulation that would be generic enough to at least put down again these principles. That is perhaps the best one can achieve at this point.
Dhruva Jaishankar, before you leave us, I mean, look, frankly, I think all the Sherpas, everyone's been trying for a year to find language. They've been in Manesar for the last 5 days trying to find language. I strongly doubt we'll be able to find appropriate language in the course of a television program that everyone will agree to sign up on. But something like that, is that something which you think is feasible? Or do you think maybe we should just reconcile ourselves to the fact there won't be a communique, there'll be some other sort of a statement?
No, I don't think we can say at this point. I mean, it's being, as of today, things were still in negotiation. So I'm not sure we should be premature about saying that there will be a statement or it won't and what it would look like. Obviously, I think there is a question of what kind of formulation can be reached. And we did have a consensus that was reached in Bali last year, which India helped broker along with others. But obviously, there's been resistance to that. There've been changes in the ministerial meetings, and I think the question remains as to whether an acceptable formulation can be found. I sense that certainly it is within the realm of possibility because there is a precedent for it, and all the countries participating have come in with a sort of constructive attitude. So I do think it is certainly within the realm of possibility. But again, this is supposed to capture a sense of consensus of all members of the G20. And again, because there have been resolutions passed at the UN Security Council again, involving many of these same actors, it certainly seems possible that some consensus can be reached.
All right, let me now get in Siddharth Tiwari, Senior Advisor, G20 India, Fellow at the Chatham House, speaking to us from Washington, D.C. As Dhruva was just saying, don't write off the possibility that there could actually be language that everyone signs off on. But India is in any case going to be very keen on a certain other set of issues that certainly should come up, the developmental agenda, African Union getting a seat. All of those are being very much talked about, but is that almost a fallback position in case we can't reach a final communique? Siddharth Tiwari,
no, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's absolutely not a fallback position. It is a front position, and let me explain to you why. That both the IMF, World Bank forecasts are saying that for the next 20, 30 years, the global south will provide the bulk of global growth. And so the development, growth of the global south is front and center, not only for global south, but for advanced economies. That if the south doesn't grow, the north doesn't grow. And that is the framework and the mindset that the affairs and leaders are behind to this.
All right, that's really interesting what you said. And if I could just play for our viewers what it was that Amitabh Kant had told us last week on the India story, just before he went into that Sherpa meeting. He did say what India is going to be trying to achieve at that Sherpa meeting. And seeing as we got it directly from the horse's mouth, let me just play one of that for you and then get comments from our panelists. This is what Amitabh Kant told us the effort is going to be to try and achieve.
The headline should be about growth and development of the world, because that's what India is focused on. It's about the last mile. It's about citizens. Our presidency has been very citizen-centric, and therefore the impact that it will have on the community of the world in terms of SDGs, in terms of we should not lose track of the basic growth issues, because 1/3 of the world is in recession, 75 countries are in global debt. So our presidency should be remembered for its unique contribution to both the citizens of the world, to growth of the world, which is sustainable and inclusive, and for being the voice of the global South. The Ukraine war is not our creation. For us, being the voice of the global South, to bring all the developmental issues up front, to be, as the Prime Minister said, very human-centric in our approach, and to focus on all our key priorities has been the primary aim. And all through the year, in our ministerials, we have pushed all these issues up front. We have brought them center stage.
So that was the G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant talking to us a week ago on the India story. Andrea Sumlan, I'm going to get both Siddharth Tiwari and Dhruv Jaishankar to react to this, because the agenda, at least from the Indian point of view, seems to be really clear-cut. And Andreas, I understand that for Europe, Ukraine is really, really important, and getting a statement on that is really, really important. But as we just heard from the Sherpa himself, from the Indian point of view, you've got to say, for the global South, there are other issues. There are questions around development. There are questions around climate change. There are questions around multilateral agencies. There are questions around having a seat at the high table. Those are also important and deserve priority. Is that a fair position, you think, or will there be some in the West who are not completely happy with that?
Well, I would challenge this position because, in a way, for the European countries, most of which are members of NATO and the European Union, the issue of protecting borders and of political sovereignty and territorial integrity is perhaps less salient, because these countries are allied with each other and to the United States. They are under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, and they have therefore a security guarantee that most countries in the global South do not have. They do not have such a firm alliance and big allies, and they should perhaps be actually more worried about such principles as inviolability of borders, territorial integrity, and political sovereignty. Right. A potential alliance that I see between Ukraine and India is that, as far as I understand, both Ukraine and India are unhappy with the current United Nations system. India is now the largest country of the world, but not a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and perhaps wants a reform of the United Nations. And Ukraine is unhappy with the permanent seat of the Russian Federation in the UN Security Council, which is actually not in accordance with the statutes of the UN Security Council, which mentions the Soviet Union.
Dhruva, I'm just going to get a quick reaction from Dhruva Jaishankar before he has to leave us. Dhruva, on that specific point, I think what Andreas is saying is that, look, some language around territorial integrity, that this is not a time for war, the fact that you can't just go on invading countries, or you can't just, I mean, territorial stuff, that is important for the South as well. I'm sure it's important for India. I mean, after all, we have a large neighbor trying to gobble up parts of our territory as well. So I guess there would be some focus on trying to get language around that, even if it doesn't make everyone happy.
No, I mean, look, there will be a formulation, some kind of formulation attempted on that mentions the Russia-Ukraine war. This was done again last year. It's been done in every ministerial, even though Russia and China have dissented. on several occasions this year under India's presidency. But I should also emphasize that, India has, when it was a member of the UN Security Council, also emphasized sovereignty and territorial inviolability as well in its statements. So I think that there is that understanding on India's part as well.
All right, Dhruva Jaishankar, thank you so much for having joined us with that perspective. We'll try and talk to you again once we know exactly what unfolds out here. Siddharth Tiwari, let me just get you into that particular debate and discussion around, and look, let's face it, everyone knew that India is going to have a real tightrope walk this year to try and match all the various objectives, never completely easy. You were hearing what Andreas was saying about that tightrope walk. You can't completely ignore the security questions, because that can affect everybody, including those who are not members of NATO. And yes, there's that developmental agenda that you were talking about and that Amitabh Kant was talking about.
So absolutely. Look, just to step back a little bit, if you look at where we are in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had one crisis after another. We had COVID, we had the cost of living crisis, the geopolitical crisis, the climate crisis, the debt crisis. Every indicator on the SDGs has receded. And in this, the challenge for the Indian presidency is that the world doesn't slip into fragmented blocks, because fragmentation will lead to lower growth. It'll be bad for Global South. It'll be bad for the Global North. There has been, in the midst of all this crisis, there has been one silver lining, and it's something Amitabh sort of touched briefly, and that's been the impact of digital public infrastructure on reaching the last mile, reaching every citizen in every country. And that's an area where India is leading the world, both in the design and the implementation. And in the next decade, the sources of growth will come from digitalization. And if you look at it that way, the Global South is well poised to reach the last mile. And it also fights against what I would call is the land fragmentation or political fragmentation, because technology is neither political and it has no boundaries.
Right, I think so. So obviously, Andreas, let me just throw that back to you. So obviously, many interests, many issues will have to be dealt with, and it is a tightrope walk. Do you think the absence of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the leaders of China and Russia, are not there here? Is there a major signal in that? And paradoxically, does it make it easier to push this entire dialogue or a process of trying to get somewhere? Does it make it easier? Does it make sure that things are not completely overshadowed by China trying to be obstructionist or by Russia?
So
maybe
G20 is
Carry on, Andreas, if you could answer that, then I'll come back to you, Mr. Tiwari. Yeah, Andreas Sumnan.
Yes, maybe these are two, I would say, revanchist powers who want to change borders, who want to change the current situations of their territories, and maybe in that way it may be actually good for this meeting if the heads of states of these two countries or the formal or informal leaders of these countries are not there. But of course, that it also downgrades then in a way the G20. And the suspicion what one has here is that China and Russia actually want to downgrade the G20 and want to upgrade other structures like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS group. So I think it's an ambivalent situation, but in any way, I think one should make most of it as it emerges now.
All right, that's a really interesting perspective, Andreas. Thank you for being with us. Mr. Tiwari, you were saying something, if I could just come back to you. On that tightrope walk, the absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, what sort of an impact is that going to make?
So, look, if you look at where China is today, China is completely dependent on the global economy. Growth in China is declining. It's below 5%. That's a historical low. The buffers have been used up. The room to maneuver is less. And if external markets shrink, that will make it even more difficult for China to rebound. So whether a leader attends or not, the reality is that China is as dependent on the global economy today as it was in the heydays of globalization, and China will need to interact with the rest of the world. And so I see no way out, barring very low growth if China chooses to go that way, for China not to be part of the global system. And frankly, Russia is in a similar position. It's in the midst of sanctions. You can see what has happened. The ruble has fallen, growth is low, and Russia is dependent on the global economy.
Let me just get another voice in to talk to us about that. Riva Ganguly Das joining us, former Secretary East of the Ministry of External Affairs. She's been Ambassador, of course. Ambassador Das, thank you for being with us. We've been looking at this from multiple perspectives of how people are looking at it. We were looking at the European view, British view. But when you look at the East, how do you think countries in the East and other countries in the South are going to be looking at G20? What are their expectations? What would they like to see achieved over the next couple of days?
First, thank you for inviting me to this program. I think India has, right from the beginning, made it very clear that it wants it to be a voice of the Global South Summit. And the geography that you mentioned mostly has the countries from the South. So there is a lot of expectation. And India has taken the very unusual step of bringing in the global voices of Global South right at the beginning of its presidency by hosting the Global South Summit, where 125 countries participated. Also, what is very significant is the invitation to the guest countries. And if you see the countries which have been invited, and I would like to particularly speak about Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina has just met Prime Minister Modi, and, a very special neighbor for us and a country where our policy of neighborhood first, act east, and in a sense, our outlook to Indo-Pacific, all of it sort of converges there. And it's a very, very special relationship. And, so the voices of these countries are being represented in this G20, and which India has very specifically said that it is a human-centric growth which it is looking for, and growth, the sustainable development goals, where we are missing out on the goals, which because of COVID, after effects of COVID, and then a lot of development assistance is going to the Ukraine. So these are all issues which directly concern the Global South, not to mention climate change, women-led development, and environmental issues.
Right. On that note, Mr. Tiwari, let me just come back to you for one last view. The fact that, in all probability, one of the most concrete results of G20, and hopefully there'll be many concrete results, but one that we are hearing a lot about is the fact that the African Union might finally get a seat on the table. Is that something that you think would be a major achievement and something that New Delhi will always be remembered for? Africa getting a long-deserved seat at the high table.
Absolutely. Look, if in a few years, the African continent will be an economic superpower. It has 6 of the 12 fastest growing countries. If it could become the largest free trade area, over 1 billion people. It is the most distressed region in terms of climate change. It is at the center of development. And therefore, Africa needs to be brought squarely in. And if India can do it, it'll be a major achievement in the expansion of the G20 in the last 3 decades.
Right. Mr. Siddharth Tiwari, thank you so much for having spoken to us and shared your perspective with us. On that question of the African Union, whom better to speak to than Gurjeet Singh, who's now joining us, former ambassador to the African Union, and perhaps somebody who can tell us how this would be seen all across Africa. This could be a tangible outcome. All of us are keeping our fingers crossed. Of course, nothing is ever done till it's done. But if this becomes one of the tangible takeaways from New Delhi, the African Union being part of G20, what would be the reaction in Africa? And how might that affect India's position in Africa? I know India and China and other countries have been justing for influence and, you know, we've done something for Africa sort of a thing for a while. How will this be seen?
So undoubtedly, it has already drawn very positive comments because nobody has ever taken Africa to the global stage except India. Please remember the Bandung Conference 1945, the non-aligned movement 1961. It has always been India which has been a partner of Africa in its place at the high tables. No other presidency of the G20 had the courage to amend the membership. India took that risk and said, we will expend diplomatic capital and we will try and persuade a divided world to come back to this and agree on something rather than only quibble over Ukraine. So I think this is something big that India is trying to do, and I remain confident that we will do it. Through this, India shows that the Europeans can't simply get together in the G20 and continue trying to run it like a G7. We need much better results. We need delivery of promises and we need fulfillment. And African countries bring the results of that to us, how unfulfilled promises mean to the countries concerned. But let's not forget that along with the trying to get the AU in, India has also tried to balance South Africa from Africa. South Africa largely represents Southern Africa. So India has invited Nigeria, has invited Egypt, and Comoros as the chair of the African Union, and Comoros is a representative of Eastern Africa. So 4 of the 5 regions of Africa are today in New Delhi to attend the G20 summit. So this is the largest African representation that any presidency has tried to do, other than those who call them to side events.
All right, that's a really interesting point of view. Anil Wadhwa now joining us, also former ambassador, also former Secretary East. So we've got ambassadors all across, and 2 people who've been former Secretary East at the Ministry of External Affairs. So this is really the right sort of a panel to try and understand. We've spoken about all that's happened with Ukraine and Russia and what's going to be happening with the West. So let's spend some time looking at the South. Ambassador Wadhwa, we were talking a week or 2 weeks ago about some of the agendas that could be building up to this. What was just being said about the African Union, is that a major deliverable? Or some of the other points also which are being discussed when it comes to digital infrastructure or the developmental agenda? What would be some of the highlights you'd look for in the next 2-3 days? Ambassador Wadhwa.
Well, certainly the inclusion of the African Union in the G20 is a big step, and I'm pretty certain that it'll receive support from the European Union. In fact, they've already a number of countries have come forward and expressed support for that idea. But most importantly, I think this is a presidency which is from the very beginning concentrated on the development agenda, as you pointed out. And most importantly, I think since we have agreed and we have offered to share our digital pack, that's very important for a number of African countries in particular, where there are lack of even banking facilities, and that helps a lot in terms of their development. Plus the fact that we've laid a lot of emphasis on debt vulnerability, and we have also talked about health emergency preparedness, digital health innovation and cooperation in pharmaceuticals. All this favors the developing countries. And at the same time, we have also talked about mitigation of climate change issues by climate financing. And that, of course, we've said can be done through the reform of multilateral lending institutions, because they have to get into the act. Otherwise, the global south will have no finances, and the promises that have been made to them will not be fulfilled. So this is an agenda which is primarily driven by the motivation of carrying those people who are left out with us. And I think the January meeting in which happened of the Global South here in New Delhi, where 125 countries were represented,
Right.
that was something which is a great initiative. It has taken this development agenda even further.
But that's if I could just throw that to you. Look, this G20 is following on the back, of course, of SCO, then there was BRICS, and there was ASEAN right now. Now G20 is taking place. Let's face it, and not to put too fine a point on it, there is a certain position that China is increasingly taking in the world. Xi Jinping is not going to be here, and that's probably great. But that's obviously one of the factors that India has to keep in mind. How do you see all of this playing itself out? We saw the dynamics at ASEAN also. We saw the dynamics that played out in parts of East Asia and Southeast Asia after that Chinese standard map came up. Do you think this is a good opportunity? G20 eventually would be a great opportunity really for India to try and do something it's often tried to do and spoken about, and which is really talk the language of the G20 and talk about it. But the question around that, sorry, it's a wrong question. The question around that will always be, in other areas, India's interests are also with the West. So how do you see this balancing act playing itself out, the North-South divide?
When India took over the presidency of the G20, it was a very difficult situation. Already, the world, which was only beginning to recover from COVID, saw the Ukraine-Russia war. So in terms of global debt, economic growth, fuel and food insecurity, these were the problems which the world was already facing. We all accept, it's a reality that it's a much more polarized world than ever before. The divisions, East-West divisions, North-South divisions are probably sharper than ever before. And so G20 in that sense, which is the presidency of G20 in that sense, gives India a great opportunity to showcase what it stands for. And India has made it very clear right from the beginning that a lot of its presidency will be about, lessons learned, sharing experiences, capacity building, and showing the world where we have reached as a nation. Today, it's a very proud day for all Indians when we see, that we are hosting such a grand event. As a Foreign Service officer, I've attended many such events in all parts of the world. But to see that we are doing it here in Delhi is really a very, very proud moment for all of us. And I think, India is showing the leadership that it really deserves. It's in terms of its growth, in terms of, at multilateral meetings for years together, we've seen how India's voice is heard, and, how we determine a lot of the negotiations are determined by India's position. So this is really a very action-oriented G20. And I think I have absolutely no doubt that the joint communique, whether we get a joint communique or we get a chairman's statement, we'll have plenty of deliverables for the G20 nations to work on. And then there are these various other outfits at which these are then acted upon. So I think India has kept the practical aspect of the grand ideas very much in focus. And I think it will be a G20 presidency which will leave its mark on the history of G20.
Right. If I could turn back to you, Ambassador Gurjeet Singh. Let's turn our attention back to Africa, because the message being given to countries like Africa would also work perhaps in Latin America or other countries of the global south. India has often tried to say that our approach is very different to the Chinese approach. China will build infrastructure projects for you, get you into debt, and then you're going to be in a debt trap, and then you're going to be struggling how to repay it, and then China will take over assets. Let's face it, that's what China has been doing. At least subtly, a lot of what seems to be said. We've been seeing these absolutely fantastic images from the Mandapam, from, for example, showcasing digital infrastructure and saying, this is the sort of a thing that India can share with you, and it's not expensive. You don't have to pay us a lot of money. You're not going to get into debt to us, and you don't have to actually be pledging your assets. Is that going to be the sort of a subtext to a lot of what is being said? to countries like the representatives from Africa?
Thank you. So certainly, I think today and tomorrow and day after are absolutely great days in our lifetime, as Riva said, as foreign service officers. This is the biggest collection of big powers in India ever. So I think this is truly a momentous occasion. Now, can we take the momentum of this occasion to really change the lot of the global south, particularly in Africa? And what you have said, yes, the digital public goods is something that can help many developing countries. I was in Jakarta just the other day for the Indo-Pacific Forum, and everybody was buzzing us about this aspect alone and saying what could have taken 50 years to have financial inclusion, India has done in 7. So I think this has made a big impact. And also the pace at which India continues to grow is impressive. So most people today look for technology and economic cooperation, and they know that India is a benign power and India will not impose conditions. It never has on Africa or on others. Right. But the problem that remains is how do we protect the portals of the big discussion forum, whether in the UN or the G20, from crisis like Ukraine? Now, frankly, if our friends in the G7 had not emphasized it repeatedly and let it be, there would not have been this doubt about a leader's communique or not. Similarly, we also need to see that unilateral sanctions also make a big difference.
All right,
so how can we acknowledge that?
Right, I think we are flat out of time, so we're just going to have to leave it there. Tomorrow we'll be back to try and summarize everything that happened. But maybe in just 30 seconds, Ambassador Badwa, you can leave us with some parting thoughts. Look, you're talking about it being a proud moment. I have to say, in my career as a journalist, been to many events, been to Davos 15 times. I have to say, both the Bharat Mandapam, the convention center, the sort of infrastructure that exists, actually a matter of some pride to see all of that happening right here in India. But of course, a lot of, though that's the imagery, that's all the spectacle. Actual work has to be done to also keep it going. Any last thoughts from you? Big headlines to keep in mind for the next 2 days.
I think India has worked very hard on this in its presidency and organized a number of excellent events, a number of meetings that have been held, the 15 ministerials, all of them have come up with excellent recommendations. I just hope that this presidency, at the end of it, is satisfied with a New Delhi declaration, which is adopted by consensus. If not, as Riva said, we still have a chairman's statement, which will have a lot of deliverables for the future for G20.
All right. I'd like to thank all of you so much for joining us. Ambassador Das, Ambassador Gurdeep Singh, Ambassador Badwa, thank you all so much for having been with us to shed light on what we should expect in the next couple of days. And that's all we have time for on the India story this week. But we will, of course, continue to closely track the actual outcomes of the G20 and see where that builds up and feeds into the India story going forward. I'm Vikram Chandra. Thanks a lot for watching.